That's very important to bring the UN family into it, because they
Yes.
all have different resources and areas of expertise and can come to bring them to bear on dealing with this particular problem.
Right.
I remember in the book, Ishmael Bea's book, that when he was finally taken away from this group, and I think it was the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, as I recall, that was very instrumental in doing this, and then he went into sort of a reacculturation situation, a re-education, and he had gotten so involved with his band. Well, he was working with the government band, as I recall, in Sierra
Yes,
Leone.
yes.
And he had, of course, they were taking drugs and that type of thing, and he was almost immune to what was going on around him, and they sort of tried to repatriate him. How does this process work? You're taking, let's say that the peacekeeping operations work, they will work to take the guns and that type of thing, and then they will start the process of bringing the children in. But how does that work from the time they're turning in their weapons to the time they actually can leave an educational facility or whatever and say, you know, I've forgotten this horrific experience, well, I'll never forget the horrific experience, but at least I can move back into civil society and not be as dysfunctional as I had been before.
Well, this is the crux of the matter, because it's one thing to enter into these action plans, then you have all these children, then what do you do? Of course, you first try to find their families, but even then, earlier, I think, you know, the UN has slowly learned lessons and evolved, and it now has something called the Paris Principles, which are supposed to guide humanitarian actors on what to do with regard to child reintegration. And when the UN first began, they just took the children and gave them back to their families. This didn't work, because once you've been a soldier, you know, it's very difficult for mothers to discipline, for children to fit in back into a domestic kind of situation. So we realized one has to then work with the communities, not only sending the children back, but that you had to work with the parents, psychosocial counseling, etc. And in addition to that, you can't seem like you're privileging, just because you've been a child soldier, they get all these benefits of schooling, or so you had to really develop the community to, and this raises big issues, because the world is ready to fund emergency aid to demobilize the child, but to enter into full-length reintegration and to have these kinds of successful programs, they say, well, that's development and it's more difficult to raise funds. So there is a resource issue, but UNICEF feels very strongly that we have to follow the child back into the community and help the families cope with the child.
That's very true, and just turning the child back over to the family or not working with the child would not be sufficient. It just would not work, because you have to work with retraining the child and help, again, to reculturate the child. It's
and
very
a lot
important.
of these children have no families. You know, many of them, Ishmael, no family.
That's right,
Everybody's
yes.
been killed, or they can't. They were so young they can't retrace their families. So we had to deal with orphans, really, and that whole issue as well. And do you institutionalize them? Do you put them with family, close family? These are all difficult choices for the humanitarian actors on the ground. But Sierra Leone, you know, in a way, when you live through such a terrible reality, there's recently, I hope to go there in November, there's a lot of new life, you know. And these young people who are child soldiers, not only Ishmael, who has written this book, there's a troupe of them who've become, who write plays now and act, who are now very involved in schools and educations. So suddenly, you know, the creative energy of the society has re-emerged in the peacetime, and these children are playing an important part. Many of them had leadership roles in these child soldier establishments, you know. So the healing has begun, I think, in Sierra Leone.
Most assuredly. Excuse me. Do you find that these child soldiers, do they maintain contact with their colleagues, others who've been taken out of these groups, or do they try to establish contact with maybe child soldiers from other countries once they get back into this repatriation situation?
Well, in a sense that there's a negative side to all this, because when it fails, the repatriation or the reintegration fails, and these young boys get together and can become criminal gangs or unorganized armed elements, and it becomes another kind of issue we have to face. a lot of this is happening. Even in Latin America, demobilized, you suddenly become a criminal gang because they don't have families. So that's why it's so crucial to reintegrate them properly.
Definitely. Now, this report, I think, obviously is going to be of great interest to many members of the General Assembly, the Security Council at the United Nations. What about non-governmental organizations? Do you find that there are a lot of human rights groups that are interested in your report and have lent their ideas to it, or would like some input into it?
The non-governmental groups, like all these kinds of issues, women, children, human rights, are of course the energy of this whole movement. In fact, one could call that there's a child protection community made up of non-governmental organizations, UN agencies, and very interested nation states. We have a group called Friends of the Mandate, which are countries that want to do something about it. We have an advisory board made up of the most dynamic NGOs, you know, very out there, doing their own reports, having new ideas, pushing us to, you know, where they do, but then we have to deal with the political realities, but they're very important. And then, of course, the UN agencies, you know, people talk about the UN. In this field, you meet so many young people. This is what people do not see in the UN. The kind of people I work with, young people, who are so dedicated, who work overtime on this issue, in the field, in the harshest of circumstances, at headquarters, and really give more than a mile. Maybe on other, if they're part of the Department of Management, they may have another outlook, but in my field, they are extremely seized with the issue, and give more than enough of their time. So between these kinds of UN personnel, NGO actors, and friendly member states, this issue has a momentum, which we hope will be sustained.
And the NGOs can provide a tremendous amount of technical expertise and financial resources too to help deal with this particular problem.
Yes, well, in the sense that, especially with the reintegration, what we do say is this, that because we monitor, we don't accept private funds or government funds, because, you know, people will use it to discredit you. Now, for example, if you take money from the West and you monitor Myanmar will say, well, they're obviously being funded. So we insist that for the monitoring process, we get money from the UN regular budget. But for reintegration, for advocacy, etc., of course, the private organizations and the donor countries, we welcome their support.
And of course, they could contribute to the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, or to any of the other United Nations agencies, the High Commission for Refugees, and just a variety of places.
Well, I think we really need resources to help with the reintegration of child soldiers, and UNICEF is calling for that. I mean, that's something that I think we can really help, and really the public can help. But I think they have programs even where you can adopt one child, etc. So one should really inquire from UNICEF how one can help that program.
Right. Now, many of our viewers are aware that if they want more information on these very complex UN topics, climate change or the elimination of polio or whatever it might be, they can go to www.un.org. But is there someplace they can go to get your report, to learn more about your report and child soldiers?
Everything's on the web, a lot of information on this issue. It's www.un.org/child/conflict.
www.un.org/child/conflict.
I hope I've got it right.
That will, that's correct. And if that doesn't work, try /children/conflict.
Oh, Google,
and it will work.
Google our name and we will be there.
And it will come up. It most certainly will. Well, it's certainly a very important study. It's a very important project. And it's one, again, that doesn't get the publicity that it should. Now, are you planning to speak out, go on a speaking tour to help raise the visibility of this issue? That's
part of my job, to be a high level. The job description calls me the independent moral voice on this issue within the UN system, so that would be part of my job, high level advocacy on this issue.
Well, Radhika Coomaraswamy is Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict at the United Nations. It's a very important topic, and even though it's happening at times 5,000 miles away from us, it's still one we need to learn a lot about and to get involved in helping to resolve this problem. And I want to thank you for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.